guys, welcome to your next project. So in this project we're going to build a Pokédex, which is basically just a bunch of Pokemon cards. As you can see, we have 150 here with the image, the ID of the Pokemon, the name, the type, and then depending on the type, the background color will be a specific color. So grass is green, the fire is this pinkish red color, water. So depending on the type, we'll set the background color. Now to get the data for this, we're going to use the Poke API, and you can test it down here so you can get by ID, which is what we're going to do, and you can get abilities and all types of other stuff. You know, I don't know much about Pokemon, so I can't really speak to that, but we're just going to fetch some basic data and create these cool looking cards. And it's fully responsive, so we'll be using Flexbox, you know, so it looks good on small screens. But yeah, let's get into it. We're going to be using the fetch API along with the sync await. We're going to have to manipulate some of the data just a little bit to get it to do what we want. So let's jump into it. All right, so we're going to get started. I have my project starter open here, and I'm just going to change the title here to Pokédex, and we're going to have an H1 with Pokédex. And underneath that, we're going to have a container that wraps around everything, which will have a class of Poké-container. I'm also going to give it an ID of Poké-container. And inside here will be basically each card is going to have a class of Pokemon. And these are going to be, there's going to be a bunch of these, and it's going to ultimately come from the JavaScript. We're going to construct this div in the JavaScript, fetch the data, and put the data inside here, and then put it in the DOM. But right now I'm just going to hard code the HTML just so we can see it and we can at least style the card. So they're going to have an inline background. So let's say style here and set the background color, because each type is going to have a specific background color. Okay, so apparently Pokemon, they have different types. I honestly have never even looked at Pokemon, so I have no clue about it. All I know is the data that we're fetching. So if you're a big Pokemon fan and I make a mistake, please don't, you know, get pissed off at me. So let's set the background, oops, I already did that. Let's set the background color to RGB. So red, green, blue, 222, 253, and 224. Okay, and then inside here we want to have an image container div. So let's say image container, and then an image, and I'm just going to grab the link here. So this is a link to the Bulbasaur Pokemon. So it looks like this, and it's going to be really big to begin with, but when we get to the CSS we'll fix that up. So under the image container here, we're going to have a class of info, which will have some info on this particular Pokemon. So span, let's give this a class of number and just hard code in here 001. Ultimately, like I said, this stuff is going to come from, you know, the API. So H3 with a class of name, and we'll say it's Bulbasaur, like that, I believe. And then small tag here with a class of type, and let's just put a label of type and then another span, and inside here is going to be the type name, which in this case is grass. Okay, so that should do it. I'm also going to put a link to the design that this was inspired by from Dribble, so I'm just going to paste that in down here just to give them credit. Alright, actually one more thing I want to do is just create a couple of these cards. So this div with the class of Pokemon, let's just copy that down twice so that there's 3 of these. Okay, so we have 3 of these cards, and ultimately again this will be coming from the JavaScript, so we won't have this HTML in this file, but we just want it there as a style. So we're going to use the Lato font, so I'm going to grab from here to here, and let's say question mark family, set that to Lato, so L-A-T-O, and then colon 300 and 400. And then let's add that font family here. Okay, so we'll change that. And then the background, so for the background we're going to use a linear gradient, but for any browser that doesn't support that, we're going to put a solid color first. So EFEFBB will be the solid background. I know we can't really see it because of the cards here, but we'll fix that in a minute. And then let's also set another background here as a linear gradient. Direction will be to the right. First color is going to be D, 4D, 3DD, and then comma, and then the next color will be EFE, FBB. Okay, so that'll be the background, which we can't currently see. And then all the flex stuff can stay. The alignment, we'll get rid of the height 100 viewport. We'll get rid of the overflow hidden because we do want scroll bars. And now you can see the background gradient here. So for the H1, I just want to separate out the letters a little. So we'll set the letter spacing to 3 pixels. And let's do the container. So the Pokédex container, that wraps around everything. I want to display that as flex. So remember, if we look at our HTML, the Poke container wraps all of these Pokemon divs, so basically all the cards. So we want to use flex blocks to turn those into flex items into a row. So display flex, it's going to put them side by side. I know the image is giant right now, but we'll fix that in a few minutes. We want to display flex. We want it to wrap, so if it goes out of its container, it'll wrap onto the next line. Okay, and you can see now that it dropped down to the next line. As far as the remaining space, we want to align items to space between. And then let's set justify content to the center. And we want it to be in the middle. Let's say margin 0 top and bottom, auto left and right. And then I'll set a max width of 1200 pixels. And we will make this responsive. Okay, so now we have the class of Pokemon, which wraps around all of, each one has a class of Pokemon, each card. And for this, let's set an initial background color of EEE. But these are going to, the background colors are going to be dynamic depending on whatever the type is. Okay, but we'll set it to that initially. Let's set the border radius to 10 pixels. Actually, you know what? We can't even see any of this, so let's do the image. Let's just take care of that image. So the Pokemon image dash container, let's do that first. And for the container, we're going to set a background color of RGBA, white, so 255 for RGB. And then for the alpha value, we'll do 0.6 for that. All right, and then we want these to be rounded images, but we're going to put the border radius on the image container. So that's going to be 50%. And I want to have a width and height of 120 pixels. Okay, so right now the image is you can see these are lined up, and you can see the image container, but the images are busting out of the container. So before we actually add anything onto that, I just want to do text align center. But then for the images, let's grab this and say for each image, I want to set a max width on that image to be 90% of its container. So that will put it inside its container, which is that, this right here. And let's just also add a margin. Let's do a margin top of 20 pixels. All right. So now that we've done that, let's go back to this class right here, the Pokemon class. And I want a box shadow on these cards. So let's set the box shadow here. We'll do 0 for vertical, horizontal, 3 pixels for the V offset, and then 15 pixels for the blur, and then for the color, it'll be RGBA. Let's do 100 for each of those, and then 0.5 for the transparency. So you can see now we have that box shadow. For spacing, let's set the margin to 10 pixels. That'll bring them apart. We need some spacing inside the card, so let's do 20 pixels inside. And you can see this gets knocked on to the next line because we have flex wrap. If we didn't have this flex wrap right here, then it's not going to do that. But this will help us make it responsive. And then finally, I just want to text align to the center. All right, now for the bottom part here, the info, let's do that. So let's say Pokemon.info. All I want on this particular class is a margin top of 20 pixels, so that's going to push everything down a little bit. And then I want to style the number. So let's say Pokemon info number. So I'm going to add a background color here, and I'm going to use RGBA because I want it to be like a transparent looking background. So let's do black and then 0.1. Okay, so you can see it gives it that transparent background look. We're going to add a little bit of padding to it. Let's do 5 pixels top and bottom, 10 pixels left and right, and set the border radius, and I'll do 10 pixels on that. And let's make it a little smaller. We'll do font size, and we'll set it to 0.8 M units. So that's going to just be whatever the wrapper is, the container font size. It's going to multiply it by 0.8, which is going to make it a little smaller. Okay, so last thing is the name. So let's say Pokemon info name. Let's set the margin to, let's do 15:07. And then let's just do the letter spacing to 1 pixel. All right, so that looks pretty good. And you see if I extend it, they'll all be on the same line. So that's the CSS. In the next video, we want to actually fetch this data, because right now it's just, we just put it in the HTML. We want to go ahead and fetch it from the API and insert it into the DOM. All right, so in this video, we're going to fetch our data from the API, and then in the next video, we'll take that data and create these cards. Now, the API that we're using is from this pokeapi.co, and there's a bunch of different endpoints we can hit. We can get the Pokemon by name, I guess, so Pokemon/Ditto will give you all the info. You can get by ID, Pokemon/1. You can get by type, abilities, and then you can get a bunch. If you say Pokemon, you can also set a limit, and this will give you a results array. But if we look at each object, it just includes the name and a URL to that particular Pokemon with the ID. Now what we want to do is show different cards on the same screen with the name, the type, the ID, the image. So we're going to have to make separate requests for each card, which, you know, if you were getting thousands of items, you probably wouldn't want to do for performance issues. But for this, it should be fine. We're just going to get 150 different cards. So we want to make requests to the ID, right? And if we look at some of the data here, we have the name, which is Bulbasaur, which is the same one we used. We get the ID, which is 1. We get the type. Now the types is going to be tricky because it's an array of objects that also has a type. So it has a type object with a name. So we need to we're going to have to use the map high order array method to get that and basically get an array of types. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. So first thing I want to do is just kind of bring in what we need. So let's say Poke Container, and we want to get that from the DOM. So let's use document get element by ID, and I have an ID of Poke-Container because that's where we're going to want to fill it with all these cards, right? Which is this right here. Ultimately, all this stuff in here is going to come from the JavaScript. So I'm also going to set a variable for the number or the count that we want. So let's say Pokemon_count, and I'm going to set that to 150. And we're going to have an object called colors that will be key value pairs of the type. So for instance, the type of fire is going to have a color of FDD/FDF. And for the rest of these, I'm just going to copy and paste them in so I don't have to type them out. And then what we'll do is create a function. I'm going to use an arrow function called fetch Pokemons. You don't have to use an arrow function, but I'm gonna. And this is going to be a for loop because we basically want to loop through this amount of times, and each number, each iteration is going to be used as an ID for the Pokemon that we're getting. So let's start off here with 1. So let I equals 1, because that's the first ID we want to get. And then as long as I is less than or equal to the Pokemon count, and then we want to just increment by 1, we'll have a function called get Pokemon and pass in I as the ID. Now this is going to return a promise, so we need to await, and up here we want to call a sync. Okay, now for that function, let's create that, get Pokemon. I'll also use a arrow function. That's going to take in an ID, and we're going to use fetch here, so let's use async await. So this is asynchronous, and then I'm going to put the URL into a variable here. So backticks, and the API URL is going to be pokeapi.co/API/version2/Pokemon, and then the ID. Okay, and the ID is being passed in. Then we want to fetch, so let's say the response is going to be equal to await the fetch promise that pass in the URL. We want JSON data, so we want to await res.json. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and console log data so you can see what we get. And if I open up my console, we have to call this. So we want to call the fetch. So fetch Pokemons. And you can see down here we get these objects with all of each Pokemon's data up to 150. And of course you could change this number here if you want. So we're able to fetch the data. Now we need to insert it into the DOM. So in the next video we're going to create a function called create Pokemon card, where for each one that we fetch, it creates a card and inserts it into the DOM. Okay, so now we're able to fetch the data. We're just console logging it though. We want to insert it into the DOM. So let's replace this console log here with a function, and we'll call that create Pokemon card. And it's going to take in the Pokemon data. So here we'll say const create Pokemon card, and that's going to take in data we'll call Pokemon. Okay, so for each one that we fetch, it's going to create a card. Now, obviously, if we had like thousands of results, this wouldn't be very efficient because we're making all of these separate requests. But I mean, this isn't a production app or anything. It's basically just, you know, for learning purposes and for fun. So, and there's only 150. It's not, you know, it fetches it pretty quickly, so we're fine. Now in here, we want to first of all create a div. So I'm going to call this Pokemon L for element, and let's say document.create element, and we want to create a div. So basically what we're doing here is constructing these divs, these Pokemon divs, and they have a class of Pokemon. So we want to add that by saying Pokemon element class list dot add class of Pokemon. Now we're gonna create basically a template here for our HTML. So let's call this Pokemon inner HTML, and we'll set this to some backticks. And what I'm going to do for now is just grab everything that's in one of these Pokemon divs, which is just the image container and the info. I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to get rid of everything that's in the initial Poke container. So all of those divs, all you should be left with in the HTML is just this. Okay, so in our script here, I'm just going to paste that in, and we'll just kind of fix this up a little bit. Okay, and then we want to insert this into our HTML. So let's say our we want our element, so Pokemon element, we want to set the inner HTML to Pokemon inner HTML. And then to put it into the DOM, we want to take the container, so underscore container, and we want to call append, dot append child, and we're going to put in the Pokemon elements, or Pokemon L. So now if I save, we get all these cards. Now it's just hard-coded data. We need to make this dynamic, right? So the image is really easy because it's just this URL and then the ID, and we have the ID on this object. It's just .id. So let's replace this one here with money sign curly braces Pokemon.id. And now you can see we have all the different images. The next thing would be the name. So the name is right here. Now we could do Pokemon.name, and that's fine, but you'll see it's lowercase. I actually want to uppercase the first one. So I'm going to create a variable up here called name, and take the Pokemon.name, and if we say .to uppercase, so if we add that and then we put down here just name, you'll see that it's all uppercase because that's what this method does. I want just the first letter uppercase. Now with a string, you can use an index just like an array. So if I want just the first letter, I could take just 0. All right, so I'm going to set this name variable to just the first letter uppercase, and if I save, that's what we get. Now let's add on the rest of the word. So we can do that by taking the Pokemon.name, and we're going to use slice. And with slice, we can get part of a string. So I want to say I want to slice from the 1 position on. Okay, because you can look at it like a string. The first one 0, second one 1. I mean, you can look at it like an array, even though it's a string. So we want from the second letter, which is the 1 position, on. So if I save, now you can see we have uppercase and the rest is lowercase. So let's see, for the ID here, where is that? So we have number, and we could do Pokemon.id, but I do want to pad it with zeros. So what I'll do is create a variable up here called ID, set it to Pokemon.id, and we want to first make it to string, so convert it to string, and then I want to pad it with zeros, and there's a method called pad start. Okay, we want to pad the beginning, so basically 3 spaces, we want to pad it with 0. And then down here, instead of Pokemon ID, I'm going to use just ID. And now we get 001, 002, so on. Now the type is going to be a little difficult because it's an array, right? If we console log Pokemon.types, and we look down here, we have an array. Some have 2, some have 1. They're objects with a type object with a name value. So let's create a variable here called type and set that. Actually, first of all, let's get the type names. So we'll say Poke-types and set that to Pokemon.types, which is what I just showed you, but I want to use map to create a new array. So map, we loop through, and we'll say for each type I want to return the type, which is an object, and I want to get the type.name. Okay, and if I console log this, so Poke_types, and we take a look, we have these arrays with 0 fire, 1 flying, so just an array of objects with the type. Now, to get the actual type of the current Pokemon, I'm going to first go up here. So we have the colors, which has all the types that we need. So I just want to create an object that'll be, 0 fire, 1 grass, and so on. So I'm going to create a variable called main types right here, and we can use object.keys because we want to use these keys here as the values. So let's pass in colors, and now if I console log main types, and we take a look, we just have an array of all the different types with number indexes. So let's go back down, and under where I have Poke types, let's say const and type, call this type. We want to take the main types, which is just a numbered list of types, and we want to find, so I'm going to call find, where the type, so we're going to loop through and say where the type, or I should say where the Poke types index, we're going to use index of, and then pass in that specific type or that iteration, and we want to see if it's greater than -1, because if there's no match, index of, this method right here, returns a -1, so we want to see if it's greater than -1. If it is, then that type is in there and it'll get put in this variable. Alright, so now down here where we have the type, this grass right here, I'm going to replace with type. Okay, so you can see grass, 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 fire, fire, water. So now it's just taking the main type and putting it in there. Now we also want the color to change depending on the type, right? So now that we have this type variable, let's set a variable here called color and set that to the colors array. And remember, the index, or the keys I should say, of these colors are the types. So we just want to use that particular type for that card or that iteration as the index for our colors. And then we just can simply set the element, so Pokemon element, we'll set the style, so we can grab any CSS style. We want the background color, so background color, and we want to set it to that particular color. So we'll save, and now the background is going to depend on the type. So fire has this red, grass has this green, water blue, bug is this orange, and so on. Okay, and that's pretty much it. And of course this is responsive. It's a 1200 pixel container with flex items that wrap, so they just go on to the next line. Alright, so that's it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this little project, and like I said, this API is really cool. You can, if you know more about Pokemon, you can deal with abilities and stuff like that. I don't really know anything about that, so yeah, like most other projects, I'd encourage you to build on to this.